In May 2007, a Nenets reindeer herder named Yuri Kuti was walking a riverbank on the Yamal Peninsula in Arctic Siberia when he spotted something small sitting exposed on a sandbar, freshly washed out by the spring melt. Skin still on, eyelashes still on, trunk, ears, tiny toenails, all still on. His first thought was not incredible scientific discovery. His first thought was closer to, oh no, whose baby is this? It was not a human baby. It was a baby woolly mammoth, and she had been dead for 42,000 years. Let that sink in, because we're about to spend the next several minutes inside the body of a creature that died before the pyramids, before writing, before agriculture, before basically everything you've ever learned about in school, and she still had her mother's milk in her stomach. And that's not even the strangest part of this story. Before scientists ever laid a hand on her, she was almost lost forever, traded away for 2 snowmobiles. We'll get there. It gets weirder before it gets over. Here's the assumption we all walk around with. Ancient animals equal bones. You picture a mammoth, you picture a skeleton in a museum, big curved tusks, a wire frame holding it together, a little plaque with some Latin on it. Dry, dusty, dead in the most boring possible way. That assumption is wrong, and this baby mammoth is the reason it's wrong. What Kuti found wasn't a skeleton. It was a body. Soft tissue, organs, skin, all of it, frozen in place for 42 millennia like the world's most extreme leftovers container. And once scientists finally got their hands on her, they didn't find dust. They found breakfast. Let's back up, because the discovery itself is only half the story, and the other half is somehow even stranger. The Yamal Peninsula sits deep in the Russian Arctic, a landscape of permafrost, ground that stays frozen year-round, which has been quietly preserving Ice Age biology for tens of thousands of years and only occasionally hands any of it back, usually when spring erosion washes a riverbank away just enough. This exact region has become one of the richest sources of Ice Age mammal remains on the planet, precisely because cold, unbroken permafrost does something modern refrigeration still can't fully replicate. And in a twist that should make you a little uncomfortable, climate change is making finds like this dramatically more common. As the Arctic thaws faster than almost any point in recorded history, more frozen riverbanks are eroding, more bodies are surfacing, and researchers are now in an actual race against the weather to reach them before the same warming that exposed them destroys them. So Kuti found her. Small, about the size of a large dog, barely 3 feet tall, no older than 1 month when she died. And this is where you'd expect the story to jump straight to a laboratory. It does not. Because Kuti, following a Nenet's belief that touching a mammoth carcass invites bad luck, some in his community even say it marks you for an early death, did not touch her. He left her exactly where she was and traveled over 100 miles to find a friend who might know what to do next. Which is, respectfully, an insane commute for a corpse he was trying to protect. And here's the cliffhanger nobody tells you about this story. While he was gone, word got out. By the time anyone official made it back to that riverbank, Lyuba was gone. She'd been sold. Not to a museum, not to a university, to a shopkeeper, by a relative of Kuti's, in exchange for 2 snowmobiles and a year's worth of food. A 42,000-year-old, scientifically priceless baby mammoth, changing hands for winter transportation and groceries. Somewhere out there is a guy who briefly owned one of the most important paleontological discoveries of the century and used it to upgrade his sled situation. Dogs got to her during that stretch and chewed off part of her ear and her tail, the only real damage her body sustained in the entire 42,000-year saga. Local police eventually stepped in, recovered her, and had her flown out by helicopter to proper researchers. So let's be honest about what just happened. She survived the actual Ice Age, glacial cycles, and 42 millennia buried in frozen mud completely intact, and she nearly didn't survive 3 confused weeks of modern humans. In gratitude, the museum named her Lyuba, after Kuti's wife, whose name means love. He found a frozen Ice Age corpse on a riverbank, and his instinct was romance. Somewhere, Mrs. Kuti is either flattered or deeply concerned. Possibly both. Once she was finally, safely, officially in scientific hands, the real strangeness could begin. Here's the detail that made paleontologists lose their minds. Lyuba wasn't just intact, She was pickled, literally. After she died, bacteria colonized her body and began producing lactic acid, the same basic chemistry that turns milk into yogurt or cabbage into sauerkraut. Except instead of fermenting a vegetable, this bacteria fermented an entire baby mammoth, slowly, from the inside, for tens of thousands of years, essentially turning her into Ice Age sauerkraut with a trunk. Combine that acidic environment with the surrounding permafrost, and you get something close to a perfect natural preservation chamber. Nature accidentally invented mammoth pickling. Nobody asked for this technology. We got it anyway, and it's the best fridge humanity never built. To actually study what was inside her without cutting into an irreplaceable specimen, researchers turned to CT scanning, performed in Japan using equipment far more advanced than anything available to earlier mammoth researchers. The team studying her was genuinely international, coordinated in part by Russian paleontologist Alexei Tikhonov, mammoth expert Daniel Fisher of the University of Michigan, and French explorer Bernard Bouygues, who had years of experience recovering Siberian mammoth remains. That's 3 countries' worth of specialists, flown in for one very small, very dead, very well-preserved baby animal. The scans gave them something no one had ever had before, a fully 3-dimensional look at a mammoth's insides, heart chambers, blood vessels, organs, all visible in detail without a single incision. And what they found inside her stomach is the detail that still makes people put their fork down mid-bite. Milk. Her mother's milk, sitting there, waiting, for 42,000 years. Fisher described opening her up and seeing it and said it looked like popping the lid off a fresh container of yogurt. White, creamy, like it had been poured that morning instead of during the actual Ice Age. Somewhere in Siberia, a mammoth mother fed her calf, and less than a month later, that meal was still sitting in that calf's stomach the day scientists finally opened her, tens of thousands of years after every living thing on Earth at that moment had already died of old age several thousand times over. That's not archaeology anymore. That's a time capsule with a pulse. But the milk wasn't alone in there. Researchers also found traces of her mother's dung, which sounds like a mistake in the lab notes until you realize modern baby elephants do the exact same thing on purpose. Young elephant calves eat small amounts of their mother's dung specifically to load up on the gut bacteria they'll need to digest plant material later in life. Luba had been doing it too. So somewhere in her final month, a baby mammoth was out here doing the Ice Age equivalent of taking a probiotic, and 42,000 years later, a room full of scientists in lab coats confirmed it under a CT scanner. Her teeth even revealed she was born in spring after a pregnancy of roughly 22 months, almost identical to a modern elephant's. Mammoths, it turns out, were basically furrier, colder weather elephants running the exact same biological playbook. So how did a healthy, milk-fed, dung-snacking baby mammoth end up dead in the first place? This is where it turns from adorable to genuinely tragic and a little bit of a crime scene. Researchers found dense mud packed into her trunk, mouth, and windpipe. The leading theory is horribly simple. She wandered into a soft, muddy riverbank, got stuck, panicked, inhaled mud trying to escape, and suffocated. No predator, no dramatic Ice Age chase scene, just a baby, a bad step, and a river that happened to be exactly cold, wet, and oxygen-starved enough to trap her body in a natural deep freeze for 42,000 years. Sometimes the universe doesn't need a monster, a puddle will do just fine. And that same muddy death is the entire reason we're talking about her today. On dry land, scavengers would have found her within hours and nothing would be left to study. The mud sealed off the oxygen decay desperately needs, almost instantly. She got unlucky in the worst possible way in the last 30 seconds of her life, and then absurdly, almost insultingly lucky for the next 42,000 years. Here's the part that should really mess with your head, though. Luba is not alone. Not even close. In October 2008, another baby mammoth turned up near the Chroma River in northeastern Siberia, found by an ivory hunter and nicknamed Chroma. She died the same way, mud in the mouth, throat, and windpipe, suffocated in a mudslide or a mud hole at around 2 months old, roughly a month older than Luba. Having two comparably preserved calves gave researchers something genuinely rare in paleontology, an actual point of comparison. Where Luba and Chroma matched, scientists could be confident they were looking at real mammoth biology. Where they differed, they could start asking why. Two babies, two mud holes, 40,000 years apart from each other. And together, they taught researchers more about mammoth development than almost any other specimens ever found. And there's a third one that takes this from strange to borderline science fiction. In 2010, a mammoth calf nicknamed Yuka turned up on the Laptev Sea coast, so well preserved that patches of her original reddish fur were still attached. Inside her skull was something no mammoth had ever given up before. An actual, structurally intact brain. Not a brain-shaped stain in the dirt, brain tissue. From that tissue, researchers extracted RNA, the molecule that carries out the instructions written in DNA, and as of right now, it is the oldest RNA ever recovered from any organism on the planet. We are talking about scientists actively reading the biological instruction manual of an animal that died around 40,000 years ago. And Yuka has one more twist that drags this whole story back to your ancestors and mine. Her body shows deliberate cut marks. Ancient humans found her, likely already dead or dying, and butchered her for meat and material. So somewhere around 40,000 years ago, an actual prehistoric human stood over that exact animal with a stone tool in hand. Thousands of years later, a scientist in a lab coat stood over the same animal with a genetic sequencer. Two completely different tools, two completely different eras of understanding, staring down at the exact same frozen mammoth. Naturally, once you've got skin, fat, milk, and now brain tissue with readable genetic material, somebody was always going to ask the obvious, slightly unhinged question: can we just bring one back? And the answer, unbelievably, is that people are actually trying. A biotech company called Colossal Biosciences has spent recent years compiling mammoth genomes spanning over 1 million years of evolution. And along the way, they built something called a woolly mouse, an actual living mouse genetically edited to grow mammoth-style shaggy fur, as proof that this kind of editing can work at all. Their stated goal is mammoth-like embryos in the near term and live calves within a few years, created not by cloning Luba or Yuka directly, since their DNA is far too degraded for that, but by editing Asian elephant cells to express mammoth traits. Even the company's own chief scientist admits what comes out the other end won't be a genetically perfect resurrected mammoth. It'll be an elephant with a very impressive number of mammoth edits. Which, fair enough, still sounds like the single greatest school field trip in the history of civilization. Which raises the question of why mammoths disappeared in the first place, since apparently someone is trying hard enough to undisappear them. Most mainland mammoth populations died out around 10,000 years ago, but a small, isolated population survived on Wrangel Island off the Siberian coast for thousands of years longer, hanging on until roughly 4,000 years ago before finally vanishing, around the same time the Egyptians were already building pyramids. Specimens like Luba and Chroma, capturing snapshots of mammoth health and development from well before that final extinction, give researchers a genuine baseline to compare against those last survivors. Part of the ongoing effort to figure out whether changing climate, human hunting pressure, or some brutal combination of both finally finished the species off. Meanwhile, the ground itself keeps doing its own quiet kind of resurrection, whether anyone asked it to or not. Luba wasn't found by a research team with GPS coordinates and a grant proposal. She surfaced because the permafrost let go of her, one spring, without warning. Chroma and Yuka turned up the same way. Which means the Arctic ground right now, today, is still full of frozen Ice Age secrets, and the warmer it gets, the faster it's willing to give them up. We are, quite literally, thawing out the Ice Age, one riverbank at a time. Luba herself no longer needs to stay frozen to survive. Researchers used a process called desiccation, carefully drawing the remaining moisture out of her tissue to stabilize her permanently, and she now lives at the Shemenovsky Museum and Exhibition Center in Salahard, not far from where she was found, occasionally touring to places like the United Kingdom and Australia in a climate-controlled case, more well-traveled at this point than most humans currently alive. A baby who never made it past 1 month old has now visited more countries than you have, survived a black market snowmobile trade, and still, technically, has her mother's last meal to her sitting inside her. Let that be humbling for a second. So next time you picture a mammoth as a dusty skeleton behind museum glass, remember Luba, curled up on a riverbank with breakfast still in her stomach, briefly owned by a man who really needed a new snowmobile. Remember Chroma, her mirror image in mud, and Yuka, with a brain old enough to outdate every civilization you've ever studied, still holding the exact cut marks left by someone whose descendants would eventually build the phone you're watching this on. Remember that under the right, freezing, muddy, oxygen-starved conditions, 42,000 years isn't ancient history. It's just very, very well-refrigerated leftovers. And somewhere in the permafrost right now, the ground is still deciding what else it's ready to hand back. If a baby mammoth with her mother's milk still in her stomach and a black market snowmobile trade in her backstory doesn't count as a plot twist from prehistory, I honestly don't know what does.
Tell me in the comments what ancient discovery you want us to dig into next. And subscribe if you want more of these frozen in time stories.